I am feeling great about covering this game. Let me tell you, I'm having a great hair day. I got my fake Burberry scarf rock. Woo! By the way, do you know the difference between a real Burberry scarf and a fake Burberry scarf? About 400 bucks. All right, the game is between Magnus Carlsen and Yuri Zimmerman. This is in 2003, before he was a star. They used to have a TV show when I was a kid, before they were stars. Well, Magnus Carlsen was only 23.85 when this game was played in 2003. His opponent with the white pieces, Yuri Zimmerman, was rated 23.20. Let's jump right in. D4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and d5. Carlsen plays the Grunfeld system. He wants to let white have a big, happy center and just attack it and tear it down. CD5, knight d5. The main move here is e4. Then knight takes and bishop g7 and black just attacks that white center. But here his opponent plays bishop to d2, a much safer move. He wants black to just take and then bishop takes c3. And it's very hard to attack that center. But after bishop g7, e4 is played. But instead of taking on c3, Magnus plays the knight to b6 and bishop to e3. So Magnus's knight is not on an ideal square, but white lost a tempo playing bishop to e3 in the first place. We'll see who that favors. Castles, bishop to b5. He wants to tempt Carlsen into playing the move c6, and then he just retreats the bishop, and this pawn would have taken away the ideal square from black's knight. But Carlsen does not bite. He's too smart for that. He plays the bishop to e6, going right after this vulnerable and weakened c4 square. D5 would be a mistake. Not only does it open up this nice, juicy, long diagonal for black's bishop, but after bishop to d7, black can then play c6 because it challenges that pawn at d5. Black would be in good shape. So after knight f3, bishop to c4 was played, and in this position, b3. Yuri Zimmerman already at move 10, playing a novelty. The main move here is bishop takes c4, and after knight c4, queen to b3. This was actually discovered after this game was played, and white actually is in pretty good shape here. So if that had been played, but he didn't play that. Instead, he played b3, kicking Magnus Carlsen's bishop. Bishop takes bishop, knight b5, and now queen to d7, gaining a tempo against that knight at b5, but also the main target is going to be this d4 pawn. And now that the queen's on d7, he can later sneak a rook in to attack d4. The knight retreats to c3. Now knight c6, again piling up. He's already got three pieces, the bishop, knight, and queen, all aiming at d4. Queen to d2, he wants to slip his rook over so he can defend the d4 pawn. Rook a to d8, continuing to pile onto that square. Rook to d1. But now this pawn is defended by the knight, the bishop, the queen, and the rook. How does black attack white's center? Well, Magnus plays this strong move, f5. This is sort of the move of last resort for a Grunfeld player to attack the center, but here it is quite powerful. A white does not want to take on f5, because then rook takes f5, castles, knight d5, and after e5, white's center is decimated, and black's pieces are very, very active. So instead, white plays e5. And one of the things is it does bury Magnus's powerful g7 bishop. It's biting on granite on e5, and that's important to notice later in the game. Knight to d5, taking advantage of those weakened light squares. Knight takes knight, queen takes, castles, and now queen to b5. Black is still going to put as much pressure on d4 as possible. He wants to maybe clear the way and double those rooks on that file. But now bishop to h6. Now we just said that this e5 move makes the g7 bishop bite on granite. So why does white want to trade off dark squared bishops? I don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Probably not the best idea. Rook d5, and now bishop to g7, which really is just a strategic mistake. That bishop was not strong there. So that really favors black, the exchange of that bishop in this position. King g7, queen c3, sort of getting out of the way of any pinning on the d file. h6 keeps the knight out of g5, and maybe black can expand with g5 himself. Rook to d2, rook over, rook f to d1. By the way, if you're getting value from this video, be sure to click the subscribe button for future videos. Now queen to b4. Magnus says, I want queens off. I just want my heavy pieces and knight to just attack this pawn with as much power as possible. Zimmerman says, I can't do that. So the queen moves, e6. Now, the idea here is maybe to retreat the rook and then play the knight to e7 and into d5. That d5 square would be a very nice spot for a knight. h4 is played. That gains space, but it actually gives black a bit of a hook. If he needs to open a second front later, he might be able to play g5. The queen goes back to e7, and that sort of aims at the g5 square as well as the h4 pawn. Queen to f4. Rook to h8, and here you can see he's beginning to move some pieces on the king side. Queen to g3. White wants to restrain this g5 push. King to f7, queen to f4, and king to e8. And you can see what Magnus is doing. He's taking his king. He wants to move it all the way over to c8, then move the queen over to g7 to help facilitate this g5 advance. Rook to c2, knight to b4, hits the rook, hits the pawn, and now rook to c4. Attacks that knight, but leaves the a2 pawn hanging. So should Magnus take the a2 pawn? Well, he doesn't. If he did, this would have happened. Knight takes a2, queen to d2, hitting the knight and taking away all its squares. Then b5 would be played. Queen takes knight, pawn takes rook, pawn takes, and in this position, white is actually completely winning. Even though he's down in exchange, this center mass of pawns combined with black's king in the center and the pawn weaknesses, white's just completely winning in this position. So Magnus does not go down that route. He retreats the rook back to d7. Queen to d2 attacks the knight again, but now the knight can settle in on that beautiful d5 square. Look at the power. It radiates all over the board. Very nice place for a knight. b4, maybe creating some counterplay on the queen side, but it's really slow. And now g5, the second front, is created. If white plays g3, just trying to hold, then f4, g4, gh4, and the threat of rook to g8 coming down this file, going after the king would be really bad news for white. So white goes ahead and takes on g5, hg5, and now queen g5. What if he takes with the knight? Well, then f4 interferes with the queen's defense of the knight. And when that knight moves, queen to h4, the other rook comes over to g7, and white's king has no chance of surviving in that position. So queen takes g5 instead. Now that's a pawn sack, but now queen to h7. Threatening checkmate on h1 already. The king moves to f1, and now rook to g7. And just look at this alignment of heavy pieces that Magnus Carlsen has on the king side. White's king is in big, big trouble. Queen to c1, and here is our just spectacular move of the game. Do you see the amazing shot that Magnus plays in this position? That's right, rook to g2. The king cannot take the rook because queen h3, king g1, queen h1 would be checkmate. So the king has to move. The king goes to e2. Now queen to g7, lining things up. Maybe he can move into this square on g4, creating a pin on the knight at f3. Rook goes to g1 to challenge those pieces, but now rook to h3, rook g2, queen g2, and now black is threatening to take that knight on f3, so the knight really has to move. Queen to e4 check. King to d2 is forced because if he goes to f1, rook to h1 is checkmate. So king to d2, knight to f4, and now the threat is queen to e2, checkmate. The queen moves to d1, but now rook to d3, check. Knight takes d3, queen d3, and in this position, white resigned. The reason, if he goes to c1, then he just loses his rook and far too much material. And if he goes to e1, what happens? That's right, knight to g2, checkmate. Now, even after going over this great game from Magnus Carlsen, there are still some great chess you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to see is in this video right here. So be sure to watch that for some amazing chess. Goodbye.